This is my presentation on enhancing equitable access to education through HyperRubrics, and it is a tool used to support motivation and growth. I'm Malia Hoffman from Cal State Fullerton, and this is for the Ed Media Conference in Edinburgh, May 2026. So my research revolves around the fact that there's too much emphasis on grades and that testing negatively impacts students' motivation and growth. In the US, students have over 100 tests that they take, standardized tests, before they get to high school. And so this research focuses on the qualitative growth and development of students along with their motivation rather than that quantitative measure of standardized tests and what traditional rubrics usually are measuring. And so this work calls for a need for alternative assessments and also alternative assessment tools with students with varied disabilities and backgrounds, focusing on underprivileged students and students who are at risk. The key constructs of this research focuses on equity and access, and the research from the literature is in parentheses here. Also looking at a growth mindset when focusing on the HyperRubrics and looking at students' motivation and confidence over time throughout this process. So starting off with what are HyperRubrics? I first learned of this tool in a podcast by Jamie Gonzalez, and that is hyperlinked here in this slide as well. And it is a digital rubric designed with hyperlinks, and it uses asset-based language, and it is a learning progression tool rather than a traditional rubric that usually focuses on negative assets or negative facets of students' work and looking at where they would lose points. And so this focuses on what students can do. So you'll notice the example here, it looks at each section starts with I can and then goes into what you're actually looking for. And then it also helps students look at the next steps for guidance. So each of these hyperlinks will provide students access to additional information. If they can't remember the lesson or need revisiting, they can use those extra tools and resources that the teacher provided for them in those hyperlinks to learn more about that. And so how they work, we look at the features, behaviors, and the outcomes. So the features are, of course, the hyperrubric and the design. So that's what the teacher or the educator focuses on is using the standard, what they want the student to learn, and then we use that to inform the behaviors. So we provide student agency, and then they also have the opportunity to revise and continue to work towards mastery of that standard. And then that leads into their motivation and confidence, which equals their learning growth, and then also access to equity. So each student, regardless of where they are entering, where they are on that standard, they have access to education, which provides equity to education for all students, all learners, regardless of whether or not they're at grade level. And this also is a tool that fosters formative feedback. Again, fostering student agency. So formative feedback from their peers, formative feedback from their teachers, and then also it can be used as a self-assessment tool. And so you'll notice the traditional rubric connected to the hyperrubric here. So the traditional rubric is on top and the hyperrubric's below. And the traditional rubric is usually leveled by a clear set of points, numeric values, whereas the hyperrubric is focusing on where they are on the standard. So beginning, developing, approaching, applying, and extending. Those are the growth-based language tools used to evaluate the student at each of those levels. The research questions were, how does the use of hyperrubrics influence students' confidence and motivation? And the second one is, in what ways, if any, do hyperrubrics contribute to equitable access to education for diverse learners? And so the context and the methods, this was a participatory action research study. It was at a U.S. Title I elementary school, which Title I is defined as 40% or more of the families are from a low income SES. And that school receives federal funding for that. The data consisted of surveys. There were 91 participants in total, open-ended responses, and student work samples. The analysis used descriptive trends, qualitative themes, and student work samples, as well as teacher rubrics. And the participants were students and teachers from grades 1, 4, and 9, and with a total of 91, as I previously mentioned. And so the qualitative results showed that student engagement and motivation, so on a 4-point Likert scale, the average was a 3. And for academic growth, it was a 3.25. Ease of implementation, so that's mostly looking at for students using the hyperlinks to learn more, and then also for teachers implementing was a 3.5, and then overall satisfaction was a 3.25. And so overall, they are over in showing a positive response rate in all of those areas for ease, engagement, motivation, growth, and then a high perceived engagement and growth support. So the qualitative results through the participation of the educators. This is shown on quotes or paraphrase quotes on this slide by the educators. The first one, the educators stated that they thought that it would be a lot of work, but in the end, they realized that it saved them more time with students working because the students could be more independent. One of the obstacles I'll note here that their school blocks YouTube and many other sites, and so they had to screen record videos outside of school and then place them in their digital drive to have access to those, which took a lot of time. And you may feel free to pause and read the other responses here for the qualitative teacher responses. And then student results were that all the students, but one of the first graders were able to self-correcting when the teacher used it for spelling, were able to self-correct their errors. So there was a total of 12 students in that one. And then in the 4th grade, all the 4th graders demonstrated measurable growth, and that was out of 136 work samples. And so on this slide, 3 themes occurred in the research. The one theme was on confidence and motivation. And so there was an overall increase of independence and self-correction in the 1st grade. And also it became a very good tool for students to be proactive in the older grades, so in grades 4 and 6. This image shows the overall connection to their motivation, engagement, their independence and self-correction, and then also just mixed reactions. So some students found it motivating, while others perceived it as an additional step, which you will get with any student being asked to do more work. And then the second theme was the growth mindset and the progress. And so the steps of the iterative learning with the clear expectations and feedback gave students that autonomy to learn more and advance throughout those levels. And so the 4th graders were able to advance on their work, and then as well as the 6th graders were able to improve their hooks and citations, specifically in their writing assignments. And so the teacher's feedback here is listed on the left. And it states that the teachers stated that they are able to give clear expectations and substantial feedback, and students were able to refine their work continuously and verbalizing their missing elements through the use of the HyperRubric. The growth mindset development was able to help structure that feedback and allow students to self-assess. And they were able to identify the areas that they needed to improve and continue to work towards mastery of that assignment and that standard. And the third theme was equity and inclusion. So students and teachers are able to provide different differentiated rubrics for students based on their level and where they are in that standard. Students are able to scaffold with those hyperlinks, and the teachers are able to align their expectations with students at different levels and different abilities. And they're able to provide multiple access points to learning and to that standard and to education by reducing the discouragement that students might find with a universal traditional rubric where students might be penalized for being below grade level and not having that understanding of that standard yet. And so this visual here shows how the use of the HyperRubrics provide equitable learning opportunities, allowing the instruction to be scaffolded for all learners based at their level. And then advanced learners can still advance independently with teachers' targeted support. So in the HyperRubric, the final section was extending, and so that's where students would be taking it beyond that standard, so beyond that expectation of meeting the standard. So the implementation and the workload, once students have learned navigation and learn how to understand and use the hyperlinks and to self-assess, then the teacher's workload did decrease. And it enabled more one-on-one and small group instruction for teachers as well. And then the ease of support and consistency. Teachers reported a strong ease of implementation once they got over the barriers of the technology limitations. And they were able to facilitate consistent use across all classroom contexts. The discussions, limitations, and implications. The contributions of this study and this research go towards a growth-oriented, inclusive assessment style that can be used across upper elementary on through high school and college. The implementation does include the time, making sure that there's digital access, and the time and calibration of the rubrics that goes into it for the teachers, and also time to teach the students how to use the tools. Limitations are that this study was a small single context. So it was only 3 different grades, first, fourth, and sixth grade, one school setting. The educators were self-reporting, the students were self-reporting, and it was overall general to their experience. Future research would look at more grade levels, more diverse populations, bigger schools, and just an overall broader context across content areas. This study focused on English language arts focus with writing and project capabilities. There was one art project that was used for the HyperRubrics as well. So it would be looking at maybe perhaps math or other project typed research or academic context. And so the takeaways and the next steps would be that overall, the HyperRubrics did support motivation and growth in all students, in all students who participated in the study. They did foster equity and access to education and student agency. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, the implementation beyond Title I context, grade levels, and content areas would be the next steps to this research. Here are the references that were included in this research. And if you want to contact me or if you have any questions or comments or want to work with me on developing this research out a bit more, here is my email address. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.